Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know, from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars, topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
Welcome in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, right here in the GSMC Podcast Network. Here's your host, Brice Lewis, back at it again to talk about all things basketball with you, professional and college, as we do have college basketball starting up very, very soon, right around the corner. So I gotta discuss some of the things happening in college basketball, but obviously we also have to get into NBA basketball as the draft. The NBA draft was Wednesday. We're going to discuss the top 3 picks in the draft and my thoughts on each situation and their impact, as this draft was not looked at as a great draft. Honestly, it's looked at as one of the worst drafts in years. You know, and we're going to talk about the state of the NBA draft as well. But we're also going to talk about all the trades and picks that were swapped last night as well. We're going to talk about that, some rumors going into the offseason, and more NBA news, and like I said, college basketball news as well. So we have a lot to talk about today on this podcast. Like I said, I just want to appreciate you guys for letting me be part of your day once again and being a part of the GSMC Basketball Podcast experience with me, your host, Brice Lewis. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, draft was last night. The consensus is that it flip-flopped from LaMelo to Anthony Edwards, who Minnesota might take. Last week it was LaMelo, and then at the beginning of this week we heard Anthony Edwards. It ended up being this week was correct. Anthony Edwards was your first overall draft pick in this year's NBA draft to Minnesota. A move that I think makes a lot of sense, and the fit just fit. So let me break down this move for Minnesota and what this means for them. Because Minnesota is a team that really never experienced any type of success until they had Jimmy Butler there, which was just really making the first round of the playoffs, which they hadn't made, and I want to say up to that point, almost a decade, when they did make it. And so they haven't had a lot of winning seasons, they haven't had a lot of success. You know, they had Andrew Wiggins and Karl-Anthony Towns and Zach LaVine. That didn't work. So then they moved off Zach LaVine, had Andrew Wiggins, Jeff Teague, Jimmy Butler, got them to a playoffs, but then we know about the issues that Jimmy Butler had with them. Andrew Wiggins seems like a very unmotivated player for most, respects, and he never really grew into the player that Minnesota expected him to grow into. Karl-Anthony Towns was really the only player out of the players they drafted that really developed into a star, because Karl-Anthony Towns is one of the better big men in the NBA. So you still had him. In this past year, if you're Minnesota, you made the move and you traded for D'Angelo Russell. You made that trade. You got yourself a young point guard who came off a career year in Brooklyn, got signed to Golden State to a max deal. The plan was always to move D'Lo, moved him to Minnesota. Andrew Wiggins was swapped in that trade. So now you got your point guard, because, D'Angelo and Karl-Anthony Towns in that pick and roll game is dangerous. So they feel like they have their point and they have their big guy. So now you got to think about the wings. What are your wing players looking like? That was maybe a place where they felt like they weren't as good. So they then made the selection with Anthony Edwards. Anthony Edwards has been touted by a lot of scouts as one of the best scorers in this draft. Needs to improve his jump shot. That's one thing people criticized him during his workouts, was his jump shot. But he's a gifted scorer, very athletic. Some people even say he kind of has a James Harden offensive comp. I wouldn't go there. But basically they're saying he's a guy who can come into the league and average 18 a game right away. And I think for what they would probably want and need from a guy like Anthony Edwards, I think it'll fit. Karl-Anthony Towns is a guy who is a stretch big, who can score in the paint and stretch the floor, can shoot the 3 ball at a good clip, get into the paint, rebound, do a lot of good things like that. D'Angelo Russell is a guy who can create his own shot, good off the pick and roll, could, hit threes. I believe he shot above 35%, I believe, from threes this year. He's a guy who also has the capability of having a big game. And then you have Anthony Edwards in there who now, you have your point, you have your guy. Now you got that guy kind of in the middle of that lineup who can also do something. It gives them three guys on the floor that you have to pay attention to, three guys on the floor that you have to, look out for. And, Minnesota is just trying to become a team that I wouldn't say necessarily they're trying to become relevant. They are trying to become relevant. But they're also trying to become a team that is taken seriously again. I mean, really, when was the last time Minnesota was really taken seriously as a team? Probably not since the Kevin Garnett days, early 2000s. That was the last time Minnesota's been taken seriously as a team. They've had so many coaching changes. So many different players have gone through Minnesota. Now, in the NBA, markets matter. Minnesota is not considered a big market. It's cold. Some people say it's boring. So it's been hard for them to attract good players there to want to play there. So they've been one of those teams that they have to build through the draft to be successful. There was a time where they were missing on a lot of their draft picks. And like I said, Karl-Anthony Towns is really the first guy in a while, maybe even since KG, that they really hit on and said, yeah, we drafted him with this selection, and he was exactly what we expected. So, they're hoping Anthony Edwards can now be that third star. They're basically hoping They drafted Karl-Anthony Towns. He's a star. Anthony Edwards, they hope he becomes a star. And then D'Angelo Russell, they feel like he's a star and thinks this core, we're going to try to build around this three-man core and see how far it can take us. Because the one thing about young stars is that you feel like, D'Angelo Russell can still get better. Karl-Anthony Towns can still get better. Anthony Edwards is a rookie, so he can clearly still get better. And so a lot of people are sitting there thinking, with that being known, maybe Minnesota has potential to really potentially even try to take off. But then with the second pick in the draft, James Wiseman was drafted by the Golden State Warriors with the second pick. It was very widely reported that Golden State wanted to move off that pick. They wanted to get a veteran player. They wanted to use it to potentially get a star, but nothing came about. So they went ahead and selected James Wiseman. Now, I'll talk about this later in the show, but there's been some sad news coming out of Golden State that Klay Thompson has ruptured his Achilles. And so he'll be out for this season. Prayers go out to Klay Thompson. So people didn't know, because it was late news, but still news before the draft, where would Golden State potentially switch off James Wiseman, try to maybe get LaMelo to go with Steph to try to fill that hole. Well, now they have another player that they're eyeing, which I'll also talk about later. But basically, now you have a big, because remember, Golden State's system has never been predicated around having good big men. They just need guys who can get some fouls, guard other teams' big men, and that was really it, because they're more of a fast-paced spread team. They're more shoot it all over the place type of team. All about separation and space. So they've never really thought about a guy like a James Wiseman would fit in that system. That's why a lot of people felt like Golden State really wasn't in love with it, especially because what a lot of times when you're a team who's trying to win championships or trying to get back into the championship picture, you don't really look at a rookie player and think, he's going to help us be a championship team this year. And so a lot of people are wondering if that's even something they even want. And people still think, even after the draft, that Golden State wants to move off James Wiseman. Now it's just a matter of who wants the right to James Wiseman. What can we get for the right to James Wiseman? So, because there are reports that people are saying Golden State may still be looking to move off it. Except now you just know who the player is that you're trying to move off of. Instead of just it's the second pick and we're trying to target a guy, it's James Wiseman, so who wants James Wiseman? And what are you willing to give us that will help us? So that's going to be interesting to see if maybe Golden State can potentially move off that pick. I don't know. But I also think Golden State is comfortable going into the season because you never know. With Klay Thompson being out for the year now, you don't know how that affects Golden State's mindset with the season. Like, maybe we need to keep him. Like, maybe we need to, because we have to form a new team again. We felt like with Klay, we'll be a championship contender. Now without Klay, what are we? We need to be competitive. Yeah, if we can still get a second star, yes, but you also got to think about it. Teams are now knowing that Golden State needs that second star to go with Steph because of the fact Klay is out. So maybe teams won't be as willing to give them, or maybe expect Golden State to give them more in return. You'll get James Wiseman back, so you're going to get your young star. But what else would you expect from Golden State? Because you know why they need it. And I'm sure Golden State's thinking, well, how could we still feel like we could compete with some of the best teams in the Western Conference without Klay Thompson? Maybe they say we might need to keep James Wiseman, because what if he becomes a gem for us? What if he becomes a really good player? Could they potentially use that even just to get to the trade deadline and say, oh, James Wiseman looks like he's a pretty good guy. Well, we'll still give you to him if you give you one of your stars. Probably someone who's disgruntled. You never know. So it's very interesting opposition, I think, to see what's going to happen with Golden State in that pick and how they feel about Wiseman moving forward. And then with the third pick, the Charlotte Hornets, Michael Jordan. They selected LaMelo Ball from the Ball family. LeVar Ball has his two sons drafted in the top 3 picks. First dad to ever have his sons do that. But LaMelo Ball, box office. Michael Jordan needed a box office attraction. So some people even were questioning, is this a good fit? I think it's a good fit. I think for what Charlotte is, they needed a guy who people would sit here and say, I want to go see him play. Because when was the last time Charlotte had a must-see player? Kemba Walker was good, but he was never must. Kemba was one of those guys that if you just look outside, you're not going to sit here and say, I want to go see a guy named Kemba Walker. But once you watch Kemba Walker, you're going to want to watch Kemba Walker every time he's on TV. But again, he's not going to make you move off another channel to watch him. It's just you have to come across him, and then you'll be entertained. LaMelo has that fan base. He has more followers than Zion Williamson on Instagram. Go check it. He has that fan base and that box office appeal with the Ball family name that will give Charlotte views and eyes. It could even get him a couple of national televised games just because he's on the team. And when you're talking about on the court success, it'll be interesting to see how they do with guards. They brought in Terry Rozier on that big deal. Devontae Graham had a big year. Some people would say that it became his team during the year. He had a big year. Then you bring in LaMelo. Is there potentially a chance that Michael might try and move one of them? I feel like Terry Rozier would be the hardest one to move because he is on the big contract. And he's not the best one, maybe in some people's heads, out of the 3. So, would that be a move that you would make? Because LaMelo's going to come in, probably start. You might want to go with Devontae Graham as your other starter. You still got P.J. Washington, a good player. He looked pretty good. Miles Bridges is pretty decent. The Charlotte has a lot of young talent. Guys who have promise, who have played well. We'll see if LaMelo being added to that mix results in more wins and potentially a playoff appearance. I'm sure Jordan's not done making moves, as he shouldn't be. But I think LaMelo doesn't have a shot, may never be a good shooter. Sometimes people who have broken shots just never are going to be good shooters. But you always just ask, can you be respectable? Can you do it to the point where defense has to respect the shot? That's going to be the big thing for LaMelo. Because he's a gifted passer, even more gifted than Lonzo. He's very athletic, but he can't shoot. And in a league where you can't shoot, it just maybe sometimes makes you wonder, what is LaMelo's true ceiling? So that's going to be interesting to keep an eye on in Charlotte to see what happens with LaMelo Ball. But that's all the time we have here on the segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into some Knicks talk, them getting Obi Toppin with the 9th pick. We're also going to get into some trade news, so stay tuned for all that here and more on the podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, I broke down the top 3 selections in the draft and discussed their situations, what I thought of each situation, and what my outlook is on each rookie last segment. So, obviously a very exciting night for a lot of people in the NBA draft. You saw it with the plenty of, insight into a lot of these guys' homes, learning more about them as guys, as people, seeing the emotions, all of it just very, very sweet to take in, guys, dreams are coming true. Dreams were coming true and people were getting paid last night. And so, it's great to see everybody who was drafted last night. And even people who weren't drafted last night, don't get your head down. Keep your head up. I'm sure teams are still going to be calling, hey, come to camp, train with us. We like you. Maybe you can make the roster. Maybe you can make it to our G League team and, go from there. Summer League team. Obviously, I don't think there's going to be a Summer League this year. But, on a normal year, you could be our Summer League team. So they probably might have to keep him on the G League team, and we'll have to go from there. So, just really, really great to see, all those young guys' dreams come true last night and going on forward. But another young guy's dream who came last night, in a surprising selection because of how far he dropped, Obi Toppin was selected by the New York Knicks at the 9th selection. Obi Toppin coming into this draft was considered by a lot of people projected to be a top 5 pick, dropped all the way to 9th for the Knicks, where the Knicks jumped on it, and they feel like they got a huge steal in Obi Toppin. A lot of people feel like in college basketball this past year, Obi Toppin was the best player in all of college basketball, especially in the A10 conference. A lot of people were just surprised he dropped so far because people felt like with his talent, how could he have dropped that far? He's a must-see player. I think he has the most top 10 plays that are dunks on ESPN's countdown as well. So if that's the case, clearly he's a highlight player, a guy who who also could be considered must see. If you want to think about his past college year, he averaged 20 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 2.2 assists. He was a sophomore coming out. Don't forget his first year, he averaged 14 points a game. And was the player of the year, won the Naismith Award, was A10 All-Freshman. He was also A10 Player of the Year, consensus AA, plus the Wooden Award finalist and a 2-time All-A10 Award winner. So he has a lot of accolades at Dayton. So, like I said, he was considered one of the best players in college basketball last year. And, it really sucks because there was so many startups with Zion and Obi Toppin. Not actually Zion. It wasn't Zion. It was Obi Toppin. College basketball last year, so many upsets. It was just such an open year. And then they had to cancel the NCAA tournament, man. It really stanked. Because it really felt like we would have had a great March Madness. Obi Toppin would have part of that. People were wondering how far could Dayton go with him as the main guy. He would be playing against some of the best competition, some of the blue chip colleges out there, and having a chance to increase his resume even more. But the Knicks got a steal. And so people now, one of the biggest fans of the Knicks in terms of his team, not necessarily in terms of how they actually are currently, but just because he is a team fan favorite of the Knicks, Stephen A. Smith, he was not happy about the pick. And some people actually weren't happy. But there were people who were ecstatic. And I think the reason is because right now, the Knicks have a lot of forwards on their team. Obi Toppin is a forward. They still have Julius Randle. Richard Robinson's a center. They still have, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. There was another forward they have as well. And basically, they're like, why do we have so many forwards? And so, clearly, I think you could maybe make this move because some people are going to be out the door. You're going to make some adjustments. But I feel like the Knicks probably felt like when he dropped to them, we need somebody who can really maybe be a box office hit a little bit. Someone who maybe we can pair with RJ Barrett, Mitchell Robinson in the front court. That front court with Mitchell and Obi Toppin is going to be maybe one of the better front courts in the NBA for years to come. I even made in my head when I was watching it, I said to myself, what if, Julius Randle and them could be used in a trade for Russell Westbrook? If they're not able to give up Mitchell Robinson and RJ Barrett and they got Russell Westbrook, you got 3 young players, you got Russell Westbrook. The Knicks now, again, I'm not saying they would be some elite team or anything of that. But I definitely think they would be a much more interesting team. They're already in a big market, so the league wants to put them on TV because of the market. And now you have players they could say, hey, you should watch the Knicks because they have Russell Westbrook. Is he going to get a never triple-double tonight? Oh, Obi Toppin. Is he going to be the breakout star of the rookie class? Oh, RJ Barrett's in the second year. You have some storylines you can go with. And so, for me, it was a move that I understand why they made. Now, clearly the Knicks need guards. That's what they need more than anything. With them not taking a guard, you would hope they would address it in free agency. A guard. You would hope that would be the move they would try to make. If they try to get Russell, maybe add another guy in there. Trade for Russell, get a Van Fleet, somebody. You're looking for a guard, right? And so, that's what you're looking at. But I like the move by the Knicks. I like the move. I like what they're trying to do. I like, what all they're trying to, do with their team's direction. They're trying to be like, we're trying to build this team up. We're trying to get up a lot of young talent. We might try to get a star in there. And then the Knicks, honestly, with the Knicks being as bad as they've been for as long as they've been, I could even see to a point where they're kind of like, we're just trying to get to a point where we're relevant again, where we can start saying, okay, we actually have a reason to put the Knicks on TV, and they actually could win big games and maybe be a playoff team. I don't think they're trying to reach for, we're trying to be a championship contender now. I think they're just trying to become relevant, and that's why they made a selection like this, because Obi Toppin can help them be relevant. And I think that's one of the reasons why this selection was made and why they did what they needed to do. So, I know I was going to talk about trades that were made this segment. But I'm actually going to push it back a segment. Because I want to talk about this now. I want to talk about the NBA draft as a whole, since we are still talking about draft. So, I feel like this is going to be a good time to talk about it. So, you've now, like I've said earlier in this podcast, and like you've heard if you've been keeping up with basketball coming up since the draft, this draft has been considered, like I said, one of the worst drafts in years. Because of COVID, so a lot of maybe good players did not come out of college because, remember, having the season to stop like that, a lot of kids might have said, you know what, let me stay for another year. With COVID and everything, a lot of uncertainty, I don't know if I want to, take that chance. So a lot of kids didn't maybe come out. But there's still guys in this draft that can develop and be good. You can still have a few stars in this draft. But there has been conversation in some news talk and sports about how important is the draft, the importance of the draft. In the NFL, the draft is very important. Teams fight to have picks. If you have a lot of picks, you're looked at as, man, you can really build a great roster from the bottom up with all those picks and find a lot of core pieces to your team. And then, MLB, you look at them, they have so many draft rounds, really outside of really the first round maybe, you don't really care too much for the rest of the draft. So the draft can have a very varying importance depending on how it's displayed. The NBA draft only has 2 rounds. That's it. They only have 2. They don't have more than just 2. They have 60 picks, 2 rounds. But it feels like the draft's importance isn't there. I think first you can contribute it to a lot of players being one and done. Unless you go to a blue chip program, you probably will not be kept up with like that unless by diehard fans of that particular school or of college basketball. Where if you're a blue chipper, you're a top 5 prospect going to a top 5 school, you're going to be in a lot of ESPN games. So just by accordance, you're going to be noticed just because of all the coverage you're going to get. But, LaMelo, since he didn't play here in America, we knew of LaMelo Ball because of his brother Lonzo, and LeVar's been talking about him for years. Out of every player in this draft, he probably had the best branding in terms of coming into this draft and say people were excited for LaMelo Ball. Truly. Anthony Edwards did not have that same height. He was the first pick. You want to know why? Because first, he did something unconventional. He went to Georgia. Now, Georgia's on TV, but it's Georgia. They're not looked at as a basketball school. Plus, remember, when you're only there for a year, like I said, the only people who pay attention to you are diehard college basketball fans, probably fans of teams that feel like they may have a chance to get you, and, you get the occasional ESPN coverage. And then you think about James Wiseman. He went to Memphis, which is considered probably maybe a top 20 program in college basketball, maybe, in terms of history. And he got, he had his, situation at Memphis and everything, but he didn't really get that much coverage. And so I feel like one reason why the NBA draft is not as special as it feels like the NFL draft is, because the NBA draft, we don't connect with these players like we do, like with NFL players. Remember, when Trevor Lawrence goes next year, we have been hearing about Trevor Lawrence for the past 3 years. You've constantly heard his name. You've constantly heard how good he is. You're more connected to him. You've watched him. You've watched the Clemson games. You've seen him in the playoffs. You've seen the social media. You've seen the news. You know who Trevor Lawrence is. Even defensive linemen, positions that are not sexy, you know who they are. And you have a connection to them. Where in the NBA draft, outside of LaMelo Ball to me, you don't have that with any of these players. So when you watch it, you're watching it to see who you select. But at the same time, it's not like you have a connection with these guys where it's just like you just know about this person. And it feels like a lot of these guys you were just introduced to truly last night during the draft. It didn't feel like you sat there and you just knew who this person was. It feels like we know Trevor Lawrence. It feels like we know Justin Fields. It doesn't feel like we know James Wiseman. It doesn't feel like we know Anthony Edwards. It feels like they're just a guy who people say is good. He was drafted high, and now we're expecting him to be good. LaMelo's the only person to me in this entire draft who we've known for years, so that's why everybody was more anticipatory about the pick. If you notice on the sports media topic discussion boards across shows that you listen to, who do they talk about the most? They talk about LaMelo Ball, because that's the one everybody is aware of, know of, connects to. They don't talk about Anthony Edwards, and he's the first overall pick. You feel like first overall pick, you got to talk about him. But you don't really hear a lot of discussion about it. You don't hear about James Wiseman. The only reason why you do is because you think Golden State might trade him. And so, and then you think about the rest of the players in the draft. They're barely getting any media coverage whatsoever. And so you really don't even know who's getting drafted, really, until they get drafted. And then it's just like, okay, I guess I got to get excited now. And so, if you think about that, there is no anticipation to watch because of that. And I think that's why the NBA draft has now been looked at as just not important. I mean, you see how teams treat the NBA draft. You see how teams go about the NBA draft. You see how they go about the picks. They don't really care for the picks. But listen, we're running out of time for this segment. I'm going to continue this and going into the next segment. And then I'm also going to start getting into the trades that happened during draft night. Stay tuned.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we discussed Obi Toppin to the Knicks. We discussed my thoughts on that move, how he dropped to the Knicks' lap. The Knicks feel like they had to select him. For the most part, has gotten pretty positive reviews because of the talent Obi Toppin is. And some people thought he could have been the best player in this draft as well. And then being able to drop to the Knicks fans should be excited to have Obi Toppin a part of the organization. We also were talking about the NBA draft and what it is now to just, fans and teams and just the importance of it. And I was talking about it at the end of last segment, and I want to finish it up before I get into the trades of draft night, because I was leaving off on the teams and what they think of the draft. And my point was, you can tell with NBA teams just how freely they give away picks. Just how freely they give away picks. The draft isn't considered that important because the thing about the NBA draft is that teams look at it like this. Every time the draft comes around, is there a transcendent player? If there's a transcendent player, now you're going to start seeing teams be like, okay, I kind of want my pick. If you have 2 or 3 transcendent players, I kind of want top 1, 2, 3 picks. I kind of want to keep them. You kind of got to give me a little bit more if you want this pick, because I could get a transcendent player unless you're giving me a great player. Where if that doesn't happen, which in this draft it wasn't, you see Warriors, number 2, trying to trade down. 3 trying to trade down. Minnesota was even open to offers. So clearly they these are good players that could help us. But if we could get something better, we will definitely give you this pick. And you don't see that in a lot of other drafts. You literally never see a team in the top 5 trade down in the NFL draft for a reason. Because those picks are valuable. These are really very quality players to put on your team. And if someone wants that pick, you're thinking to yourself, you better be willing to give up something to get this pick, to be able to pick a top player in this position. NBA, literally after the top 3 picks you saw last night, who cared about 4? Who cared about 5? Who cared about, really, let's just be honest here. Who cared? I mean, unless it's your team drafting, it felt like, okay, after the top 3 picks, the rest of the draft was kind of like, okay. Again, it was for basketball diehards, if you're a basketball diehard, or your team is about to select, and that's why you tuned in. It wasn't because we're the NFL draft where you just want to see every player, where he goes, where they can be traded to, where they end up. There's more storylines. There's more anticipation. You don't see that with the NBA draft. And that's why I think the draft is just, honestly, it's supposed to be a big deal, but it just comes off kind of flat when you try to watch it. And it's not considered that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. And I think that's kind of where the issue kind of lies. Really, I think that's where the issue kind of can lie, because if the importance isn't there in the draft and you have people who are wanting to go and invest, you have your own teams kind of make it seem like the draft doesn't matter. You have, even though you try to put investment through the networks into the draft, it just isn't generating that fan interest unless there's this transcendent player in there, like a Zion Williamson. When Zion was in the draft last year, people watched the draft because they wanted. It is funny because the draft is like this. Whoever gets the top pick, whoever is the consensus top player, you know is going to where they want to go, but you still want to watch it to see that player. This year, you had parity in the top 3. You didn't know who was going to go number 1. But that still wasn't enough to get people invested to watch the draft. Because it was just like, well, why do I care about these players? Unless it's LaMelo Ball, I hope Anthony Edwards is good. I hope he's a player that I will eventually care about to that extent if you are the casual fan. But they don't come off my noggin and think, yeah, this is a guy that I'm told everybody's telling me to tune into and I need to tune into. So that's kind of how the NBA draft is looked at. But now I want to get to some trades that actually happened last night. And I want to get into my first trade. I want to get into the Seth Curry trade. Seth Curry, Dallas Mavericks, traded to the Philadelphia 76ers to play under his father-in-law, Doc Rivers, as he was traded from the Dallas. And this was a really good move for, I think, the Sixers. But in the trade, Philadelphia sent back Josh Richardson in this trade and the number 36 pick from the draft for Seth. So Seth Curry, 30 years old, has the second highest three-point percentage in NBA history behind Steve Kerr. This was a very interesting move for Philadelphia. They actually made another move too the day previously. But this is a very interesting move for Philadelphia because they are committed to giving the Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid duo another chance. They're looking to say, okay, we're willing to give it another chance. We're willing to see if this works. So let's start trying to build around it with Doc Rivers as the coach. They have moved out of Al Horford, and they gave up a couple of picks with Al Horford for Danny Green. That's the other trade Philadelphia made. And they brought back Danny Green to add spacing. Seth Curry adds spacing. They're clearly trying to say, okay, if we're going to have these two and they both need the paint, we need to make sure everybody else on this team can spread the floor. Because what was one of the biggest flaws with the 76ers last year is that Josh Richardson can shoot, but isn't really a spacer. Tobias Harris can shoot, but isn't really known as a spacer. And so sometimes if you watch the 76 offense last year, you saw how stagnant it was. It felt like it was congested sometimes. And I think what Doc's trying to do with these moves is take some guys who eat space, like Al Horford and Josh Richardson, and bring in guys who give space, like Seth Curry and Danny Green. Because they're trying to make it where maybe they can do a bit of an inside-out kind of game. You know, you got three-point shooters roaming around. You got Ben and Jaleel doing their thing, and it works. Because you still got Jaleel, who is one of the better defenders in the league. Ben Simmons, that's one thing you can never say about Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons will sit there and defend his butt off if he has to. So you know you got two top defenders on your team. That's one thing they can do. You ain't got to be in the paint, outside the paint to defend. You just got to be able to defend. It's the offensive end where they have their issues. But they're trying to add spacers around the team so that way they can create the space so Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid could operate. I think it's something that could work. I think it's something that has the potential to work. And we'll have to see how everything goes. I think Seth is going to be big. Just also, it gives them a second point guard that they really can say, hey, come stretch the floor with Ben. You know, if they want to play Ben off ball more, potentially, they could do that with Steph Curry or Shake Milton. And so, like I said, it gives them options. It gives them flexibility. It gives them, just a good, consistent team that they're trying to build. So they're going to space everybody out and say, hey, let's make this work. And so we're going to have to see how it all turns out, but I think those were good moves for Philadelphia. And then we have more news on another trade So I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the Warriors were looking into potentially adding Kelly Oubre. It looks like they're going to add Kelly Oubre. The trade was not made official. The trade, just looking at my phone, was just made official. The Warriors are acquiring Kelly Oubre from the Oklahoma City Thunder. And they're also going to give a draft pick to Oklahoma City as well. So they're acquiring that contract and they're giving up a pick. And so clearly this was a move that they feel like they had to make. Now, Kelly Oubre is not Klay Thompson. Let's go ahead, get that out there now. He is not Klay Thompson. We understand that. We know that. We get that. But what is going on and what is happening here is they needed a guy like Kelly Oubre to kind of you make this move, you make this deal to help mend the wound of Klay Thompson being out for the year. And with Kelly Oubre, you have a guy who's coming off a career year, averaged 18 last year, a guy who has improved his three-point shot, a willing defender. Like I said, isn't Klay, but can still ball. Now, if you're Golden State, let's say you can't get off Wiseman. If you look at your team, you got Steph, you got Draymond, you got Kelly Oubre, you got Andrew Wiggins, and you got James Wiseman. Now, if you just look at that roster, that starting lineup, that's not, to me, what's one thing we saw in the finals with the Raptors when Klay went down and KD went down? Golden State didn't have a lot outside of that, outside of Steph. With this roster, you don't have Klay or KD, but you have Kelly Oubre. You have Andrew Wiggins if he, gets motivated and he plays better and makes improvements. James Wiseman, if he is what everybody says he is, should be a solid big man in this league. If you're the Warriors and you look at that starting five, that's pretty, to me, that's a pretty good starting five. Like, that's still a team to me that should be very competitive. They may not be a championship level team, but they definitely will be a competitive team. They could be a tier 2 Western Conference team with Utah, Portland, in that group. And depending on how they fill out the rest of the roster, hey, if I'm Golden State, I wouldn't look at this, obviously, losing Klay, huge loss. But I look at this and I sit here and say, it's not like we lost Klay and now we're in danger of being a playoff team. As long as, Steph and them stays healthy, I think with that starting five, and Steve Kerr, in the system they run, Golden State could still be a very competitive team this year and still, win some games. I truly believe that. So, if you're able to maybe acquire a star player, fantastic. If not, it's not like like I said, they're in a better position now with this injury than they were last year. Because remember, last year anyway, when Steph, especially when he went down, you kind of were like, okay, yeah, definitely rebuilding team, new team, whatever. Now, without Klay, it's like, okay, we have more talent. We have very young and up-and-coming big. We have Andrew Wiggins. We have Kelly Oubre. It's not like we don't have anybody, and I think that's going to be the important thing moving forward. So I think Golden State's still in a better position than they have been in this situation. So we'll have to see what happens in Golden State. But coming up next here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast, we're going to get into some news. The Bucks, the Bogdanovich trade was null and void. It fell through. We'll talk about why and other NBA news. So stay tuned right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, I finished my discussion on the NBA draft, what it means now, and how the NBA draft doesn't have that meaning and that importance like other professional drafts do, especially the NFL draft, and that discussion. We also discussed trades. Steph Curry leaving the Mavs, going to the Sixers. Also, Al Horford leaving the Sixers, going to the Thunder, while the Thunder also sends back Danny Green. We talked about the Warriors getting Kelly Oubre to help out with the loss of Klay Thompson. Now, I said if you look at that starting lineup, Steph Curry, Kelly Oubre, Andrew Wiggins, Draymond Green, James Wiseman, that's not a bad lineup. Not a championship lineup, but not a bad lineup nonetheless. And, you know, that's what we discussed last segment here on GSMC Basketball Podcast. Before I continue and get into this, I would like to tell the folks, don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Don't forget to follow us on the Bird at GSMC_basketball so we can interact with you with everything basketball related. And have fun on there, really. Just do it to really want to interact with you guys. Really, really definitely appreciate it. So don't forget to follow us again, GSMC_basketball. But now we're going to get into some more news. So earlier this week, the Bucks had agreed to a trade. They were going to get Boban Bogdanović. They were going to give up Dante DiVincenzo, Ersan Ilyasova, DJ Wilson for Bogdanović and Justin James. But the trade fell through because apparently Bogdanović did not agree to the trade. He did not say, I am good to go with this trade to Milwaukee. And so it was kind of weird. You've never really heard a situation. I mean, you know players have no trade clauses, but you've never heard of a trade being vetoed because a player was just like, I didn't agree to go here. Because you've seen players get traded to teams they never want to play with, and you've never gotten it canceled. So it was interesting how he canceled this trade basically by saying, no, I'm not going to Milwaukee. That's what it sounds like. He just basically was just like, I'm not agreeing to this. And some people say it's because he wanted the ability to be able to find a team that he wants to go to. He did not want to be traded to a team and then lose his right to have an opportunity to maybe make as much money as he could, or potentially go and pick a team that he would rather play with. Because right now, what the Kings are hoping for with this trade being vetoed is they can maybe still potentially do a sign and trade for him if he does decide to go somewhere else. And they are also reporting it probably will not be Milwaukee. So maybe he just has maybe a personal, he's not like, I don't want to play for Milwaukee. You would think, that's a good team. You're going to be competing right away. You got Giannis. You've been used to not really winning in Sacramento. It's Milwaukee, but you're going to be in a playoff situation. And yet you're hearing him say, you know what, I'm good on it. So now the NBA has launched an investigation into it, trying to figure out what all happened here. How did we have a trade, and then literally next thing you know, the trade falls apart because he didn't agree? Like, wait, how did we get to this point? And so they're trying to investigate everything that happened. Was something forced against somebody's will? Like, what happened? So it's an interesting story because it's just weird how we got to that point. We don't know how all this came about because it just didn't seem like it made sense. But they got there. And so now we're going to have to see what all happens. But in other news, Gordon Hayward declines his $34 million option and will enter free agency. This move actually was met with some mixed options because some people think with where Gordon Hayward is right now, coming off of an injury, not really playing that well in the playoffs, being hurt in the playoffs, some people think he might not make the same money he would have made if he kept his deal, because usually some players opt in because they know they're not going to get this money anywhere else. And as an agent, you're always like, okay, I got to make my most money for my client. Well, apparently, Gordon Hayward must feel like, based off what his agent tells him, he can probably get that, if not more, for another team. Now, we know before free agency, the Hawks have clear interest in Gordon Hayward. They're interested in bringing him in. They have cap space, so they can pay him a big contract. We also have just learned that the Knicks are also aggressively going to pursue Gordon Hayward. So maybe that's why he sees that two teams have cap space and are willing to pay big bucks and says, you know what, I can afford to opt out and still get a big contract while being on a different team. So, we'll have to see. Listen, with Cap not being as great as it would have been because of COVID, could it be a chance that he's maybe not going to make as much money as he would have? This could all very well be a move where it's just like, hey, he feels like this isn't going to work for me. He feels like it's time for me to move on. It's time for me to go to a new place. It's time for me to go somewhere new. And that could be why he's making that move. So we can't hate it. And we got to see what happens. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But we're going to keep an eye on that moving forward. I think Gordon Hayward, Knicks and Hawks right now look like the two destinations that he'll go to, unless another team comes up and says, hey, we want to maybe give you some money too. And then maybe it may come down to who he feels like he can get the amount of money that he is comfortable with, while also feeling like, hey, maybe this is the best team I can be a part of moving forward. So we're going to have to see what all happens when it gets down to it. And then in other news, the Lakers have some decisions they have to make on a couple of players. First, Dwight Howard. According to ESPN's Ramona Shelburne, Dwight Howard is the guy that they call 3 times a week. But the question is, listen, winning a championship, playing as well as Dwight played, Dwight might have a market outside of LA. There may be some teams that are saying, hey, Dwight, come do that here, and we might give you a little bit more money. So now if you're Dwight, you got to sit here and think, I'm older, I just won a championship, my legacy pretty much has still been defined, so I don't necessarily need to stay to change anything. So is that potentially where he would be like, hey, I might need to go to a team that's willing to pay me some money? Because like they said, the Lakers have made it clear to Dwight, hey, we want you back, man. We want you to stay with us. We want you to be a part of us. But does Dwight want to come back? And does he feel like, hey, could I potentially go somewhere else and make more money there? So, if the money is right, we'll see. Because, Dwight probably feels like he said on an interview, he says, I feel like I deserve the right to have an opinion on my contract. Because remember, he took a unguaranteed deal with the Lakers this year to prove himself. So he probably feels like, hey, after the year I had, I deserve a little bit of a pay raise. And so we'll have to see if that results in him leaving. Because remember, the Lakers have a lot of decisions to make on a lot of players. And we'll have to see how it all works out. And then also Avery Bradley. Avery Bradley this past year was effective when he did play, but was injury prone. Only played in 49 games due to injuries. And then on top of that, they won a championship without him. So Bradley's big question mark and decision is, will he opt in or will he opt out? He has until Thursday to decide if he's going to pick up his player option. The reports say he wants to stay in Los Angeles, but he wants a new deal. Now, with the Lakers having the success they had without him, that doesn't really help his leverage. So he may have to, take what he can get. But at the same time, he shouldn't be afraid to maybe get somebody he wants, or try to go to a team that wants to pay him what he wants. And Avery Bradley's kind of in a position where he also kind of has to prove himself. He's in a position where he kind of has to say, hey, I still have to show teams I can ball, and I'm still a very quality player. And maybe staying in Los Angeles with the Lakers may be the best team to do that. I think that would be a good move for him, and I don't see why he would be so, ready to leave that situation. Knowing he'll be in a championship situation, and so his talents will be very much displayed to a lot of teams around the league. And then we're going to get into one more trade before we get out of here. The Clippers, Nets, and Pistons also made a trade on draft night. The Pistons got the 19th overall pick. The Clippers traded Larry Shamet to the Nets, and the Clippers get Luke Kennard. This really is a move for the Clippers because they wanted to add shooting. Luke Kennard is a 40% three-point shooter. So they've added a guy who can now stretch the floor. If you really think about their team, the Clippers really never had a designated, he's our three-point shooter, if you think about it. They had a lot of playmakers on the team, but they didn't have a designated 3-and-D. Like, you had 3-and-D guys, but not a guy who you just know is known as a sharp shooter. And now they've added that. Larry Shamet is a good player, but isn't a sharp shooter. He's just a good player who can do some things, play well defensively, get some shots off, make some things happen. Luke Kennard is a guy who may be somewhat of a liability defensively, but is a sharp shooter, can have a big night. And I think every team, you see what happens with Joe Harris, you see what happens with Duncan Robinson. I think every team feels like you need a guy like that who could just, you know what, hey, start lighting them up from the three-point line. We need you to start taking threes. We need you to start doing big things, and we need you to do it effectively, efficiently, and help space the floor. So that's going to be big as spacing. Spacing is huge in the NBA. So this was a move that I think the Clippers got better in. Now, we won't know until, the season starts, and we'll see if he actually gets rotation minutes, because the Clippers are a deep team, but I think this is a good move for the Clippers, and I think they're going to get better. But that's all the time we have here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being part of my day. Thank you for letting me be a part of your day, actually. Like I said, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at GSMC_basketball. And don't also forget to listen to our other amazing podcasts here at the GSMC Podcast Network. This is your host, Brice Lewis, saying, I hope you all have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.